Let's go.
Okay. Hello and welcome, everyone. It's my pleasure to be here today on behalf of MIT Sloan Club of New York to welcome and introduce our two distinguished speakers, General David Petraeus and Dr. Andrew Lo, who have each made significant contributions to their respective fields. Before I go on, I want to take a moment to thank both General Petraeus and Dr. Lo for taking the time out of their busy schedules to be here with us tonight. I also want to thank my teammate, Sam Hugh, who helped organize this incredible event. And finally, I want to thank our audience for joining us for what promises to be an insightful discussion. General Petraeus is a partner in the global investment firm KKR, and he's the chairman of the KKR Global Institute, which he established in 2013. Prior to joining KKR, General Petraeus served over 37 years in the United States military, culminating his career with 6 consecutive commands as a general officer, 5 of which were in combat. Following his military service, he served as the director of the CIA. He's a personal venture capitalist, a visiting fellow lecturer at the Yale University, a speaker with the Washington Speakers Bureau, and he co-authored with Andrew Roberts the forthcoming book, Conflict. Over the past 20 years, among his countless awards and recognitions, General Petraeus has been named one of America's 25 best leaders by U.S. News and World Report. And he was a runner-up for Time Magazine's Person of the Year. Our moderator, Dr. Andrew Lo, is the Charles E. and Susan T. Harris Professor of Finance and Director of the Laboratory for Financial Engineering at MIT Sloan School of Management. He's also a principal investigator at the MIT Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence Laboratory, and no stranger to the MIT Sloan Club of New York, where he has presented on several occasions. And he'll be moderating tonight's Fireside Chat with General Petraeus. Please use the Q&A box in Zoom to submit your questions. We'll be dedicating the last 20 minutes to answer as many questions as possible. Without further ado, I would like to hand over the conversation to Dr. Lo and General Petraeus. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Anusha. And welcome, everybody, to this extraordinary Fireside Chat with General Petraeus. General Petraeus, thank you so much for joining us today. And it's a pleasure and an honor for me to be here with you.
Pleasure to be with you, Professor. Thanks. And, you know, given all your accomplishments, I'm wondering if I shouldn't be interviewing you. And thanks, Anusha and Sam, for pulling this together. And thanks in particular for not mentioning that I was beat out for Time Person of the Year by Vladimir Putin.
That's an irony that's not lost on anybody at this gathering.
No, Ukraine is very personal. I've since been sanctioned by him as well, I'm happy to note.
Well, we're actually going to get to that topic. That's definitely top of mind. But before we get there, I'd like to talk a little bit about your background, which is a very interesting and unusual background for somebody as accomplished in the military. And that is that, you know, in addition to being General Petraeus, you are also Dr. Petraeus. You have a doctorate in international relations from Princeton, and you taught as an assistant professor, and you still teach to this day. Not all the armed services allow their on-track junior officers this much time away from operations. So I was wondering, you know, how important was that academic background to you? And how is it that the military, you know, gave you this much leeway? Because it was time away, but it was also quite important to your career.
Well, it was really a life-changing experience. In fact, I have often noted to others who ask for advice, you know, what should they do? I say, seek out of your intellectual comfort zone experiences. And for me, graduate school at Princeton was very much out of my intellectual comfort zone, especially because I've been a pre-med major at West Point. I'd never even taken an economics course, and I had to take advanced micro, macro, international, and regression analysis. So I struggled mightily, but made it. And frankly, I wasn't given all that much time. I was given 2 years. That was the idea, was to get a master's degree to enable me to teach at West Point, where I did teach international relations and also economics. But I figured as long as I was there, I had to try to get the most out of it. And I decided that I would try to complete all the coursework and general exams and oral and all the rest of that, language and so forth, for the PhD at the same time that I was doing the master's, which was actually quite a substantial chore, because the master's in the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs is a professional degree with a lot of toolbox courses, and the PhD required the typical theory, the academic, so political philosophy, again, economics, very heavy duty economics, rather than the master's, which was just the basic courses and so on. So it was a big lift. It was a real push, but it was hugely beneficial down the road. And I was able to get all that done, and also to get the prospectus for the dissertation approved. That required an oral exam as well. And then what I did I had only 2 years at West Point. I got pulled out early from there to go be a speechwriter for the Supreme Allied Commander Europe. But what that enabled me to do is then to finish the dissertation during that time. But that required, again, another substantial push. But the academic component was hugely important. And actually, throughout my career, I tried to do different stuff. Instead of doing the infantry officer advanced course, I was an infantry officer. I did the armor officer advanced course. And to make sure I could do that, I did the infantry course by correspondence in advance, so that when they sent me the orders for the infantry one, I said, no, I've already done that. I'll go to the armor one, if you will. And again, it was a broadening experience. It was different. It was out of my intellectual comfort zone. Instead of doing the War College, I did a fellowship at Georgetown. Instead of finishing the fellowship, I was pulled out halfway through that to go be the chief of operations for the United Nations force in Haiti, which was an incredibly developing experience. Because I was not U.S. I was actually a UN officer only, not a U.S. officer, not dual-hatted as it was usually the case later on for me in various NATO assignments. And I had to interface directly with the United Nations, with the Director of Peacekeeping Operations, and oversaw a coalition of some 25 or so countries, which was hugely valuable in later years, when all of a sudden I was commanding even bigger coalitions in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. But the intellectual capital that I at least sought to develop in that experience at Princeton, and then in writing the dissertation, and I chose a topic deliberately that would force me to come to grips with what I think is the most important task that military leaders have, which is to give advice on the use of force. So the dissertation was on the American military and the lessons of Vietnam. It was essentially how Vietnam influenced thinking of our senior military on the use of force. And of course, to show that it really did have an impact, I had to go back and look at what the character of advice was on the use of force by the military prior to Vietnam. And it was also just a wonderful excuse to actually track down and interview heroes of mine, Ridgway and Gavin, and then Brzezinski and a variety of others over the years. And it gave me the biggest of the big ideas when I was later a 4-star commander in Iraq and Afghanistan, advising the president as his theater commander, particularly on the drawdown of our forces. And it gave me the big idea that my advice should be based on the military realities on the ground, the mission assigned to us, the tasks associated with that, informed by an awareness of what the president also has to deal with, such as, getting reelected, congressional politics, strain on the force, budget deficits, the opportunity cost of forces in Iraq or Afghanistan as opposed to in the Indo-Pacific or what have you. Again, a host of other issues that aren't mine, informed by that, but actually driven by this other. That's not what all military leaders have done over the years, yet I think that is the right approach to take. Otherwise, you start to erode your integrity, because you start to figure out, well, what does the president want to hear? Or what will help him politically? That shouldn't be the job of the military commander. It should be, and I developed that during the conduct of the completion of the dissertation. So I've always enjoyed the academic back and forth, as we discussed before we went on air. I've subsequently, after leaving government, also taught at the City University in New York once a week, actually, a course called the North American Decades, about 4 great revolutions and how North America, if it really did what we could, that would be the future, not the Asian century would follow. What would follow the American century would be the North American decades. I was, as I noted, a part-time, non-resident fellow at Harvard for 6 years at the Belfer Center. Had a chair at the University of Southern California. It was a 1 week a semester out there for 6 years. And now, as was noted, I'm a lecturer at Yale. I teach in the spring semester, of course, on great power competition. And again, that provides intellectual capital on which I draw as the chairman of the KKR Global Institute. Because what we're doing is coming to grips with a world that has been profoundly transformed from one of 10 years ago when I established the Global Institute at the request of the founders of KKR. It was a world of benign globalization in which the barriers to trade, investment, and capital flows were all going down. As you know, Professor Well, globalization, at least in terms of global trade, was going straight up almost at 45 degrees. And now, 10 years later, we're in an era of renewed great power rivalries. The barriers to trade, investment, capital flows are all going up, and globalization has become slowbalization. Global trade is still gradually increasing, but at a much lower rate than was the case, again, a decade ago. That's the global context, which has enormous implications. And we can get into all of these, if the students want to get into that later. Because there are enormous ramifications of all of this. It's the single biggest issue with which we are all dealing, I think all firms like ours. But that sets the context in which the other discussion points that we pursue should be viewed.
Mm-hmm. So I have to say that when I listen to you talk and when I read your writings, you seem like much more of an economist than a general. And I wonder, I don't mean that as an insult.
Actually.
Well, a lot of economics.
I enjoyed teaching economics. I struggled to get through it initially in Princeton. I actually got a D on my first advanced micro. When I started graduate school, having never taken a true economics course, they didn't have it in West Point at that time. I didn't know that a demand curve went down and a supply curve went up. So I was literally going through your old colleague, Paul Samuelson's, Economics 101 classic textbook, as on stage, they're talking about advanced micro and then later advanced macro. In fact, I had to bet the entire PhD on advanced macro because I was taking so many different courses for, the master's and the PhD. I couldn't actually take that course. There was a conflict. So I took all the lecture notes, worked hard through it, and the deal was in the rule book, if you got an A- or better in the final exam, you got credit for that course. And I eked out an A-, and that was the key to the successful completion of all the coursework and ultimately general exams.
I don't think the viewers on this webinar understand just how extraordinary an accomplishment that is to get your master's degree and your PhD at the same time in 2 years. It's extraordinary.
Well, the dissertation took longer. Again, what I had to do was get through all the requirements. But even that was an enormous struggle. Yeah. And my language skills weren't up. I had to take a refresher course for that as well. And again, it was just one after another. But thankfully got through it. And again, it was it was the most important professional development experience I had while in uniform. So despite all the others, obviously there were lots of other experiences along the way that helped me be prepared. I truly believe that luck is what happens when preparation means opportunity. And I really set out to prepare for what actually turned out to be these incredible opportunities, but, may not have been. And I should just note finally, I was told that I was committing professional suicide by going to graduate school rather than going to the Ranger Regiment, which was the other option. But I'd had a boss who was a real soldier, scholar, statesman. He ultimately was the Supreme Allied Commander who pulled me out of West Point. I worked for him 3 different times personally. And he actually asked me, don't you think you should raise your intellectual sights farther than the maximum effective range of an M60 machine gun? I sort of got the message. And again, I've done very well at West Point. I've been, a star man. I had actually had a slot in the medical school program. And then I realized I was just doing that because it was the highest academic mountain to climb. And once I got at the top, I realized it didn't have the calling that I think a medical doctor really should have.
So did all of this focus on the scholarship make you an outlier among your military colleagues? Because I imagine that you bring to the table a very broad perspective, and we're going to get into a little bit later on your approach to counterinsurgency, because your background was really unique in shaping your approach. But did that make you an odd man out relative to your other colleagues?
Well, again, there are times that folks that, you go to an infantry battalion that don't impress me much, how many push-ups can you do? But I could also do push-ups and run and pull-ups and, a variety of other things. So I could, you had to be the whole person.
Yeah.
And one of the joys of West Point was I realized that the three components that are treasured at West Point, I was actually pretty good at them: academics, leadership, and then athletics. And I played also intercollegiate soccer and was an intercollegiate ski racer. And we made it all the way to the NCAA Eastern Championships. So again, if you can pull all those together, then, but you had to prove yourself as an infantry officer, as an infantry leader. And I could carry a rucksack. And loved to compete at that as well. And I was a competitive long distance runner and all the rest also. So, but yeah, again, there weren't too many folks who had done that. There was a handful of people who had, hardcore master's degrees that mostly had taught at West Point. And thankfully, the Army now does, and most of the services recognize that there is real value in this. And there is actually a pathway now that is more possible for individuals to actually get a master's degree and years later go back and do a PhD sort of in a more measured way. The problem is that means years out of your time in the infantry. And I actually was away from the infantry because I was at the Staff College, Graduate School, West Point, and then speechwriter with the Supreme Allied Commander for 6 years, and then went back to an infantry unit, and thankfully was able to get back up to speed sufficiently quickly that it didn't end my career, as many had predicted.
Yeah. Well, I'd like to turn now to the next logical application of some of these ideas that you developed in graduate school in terms of nation building, and your experience in Haiti and Bosnia. It really ultimately led to an economic approach to counterinsurgency that really involved improving the lives of the people that were in whatever country you're operating in. First of all, can you describe how you got to that particular view?
Yeah, sure.
And then talk a bit about the experience.
Yep. So another summer, I was able to go to El Salvador. I got out of running a rifle range. Again, General Galvin pulled me, the same guy. He pulled me down there to be a speechwriter. I got to see he was the commander in chief of the entire theater of basically of Central and South America. But that provided a wonderful window into what was a really impressive, comprehensive civil military counterinsurgency campaign that was being conducted by the Salvadoran military with the support of American military trainers and advisors. It was an extraordinary opportunity. And the individual who had helped craft that campaign plan actually was American and a fluent Spanish speaker and so forth. So that was the first introduction. I then studied it very intently, of course, as was mentioned, by picking Vietnam as the subject of my dissertation, albeit how it influenced use of force, but you had to look at the aspect of that as well. And by the way, I've just re-looked at that as part of this book on conflict with the British historian Andrew Roberts, and the Vietnam chapter is very striking because I realize with the benefit of several decades more of release of information and declassification, we did not get the strategy right in Vietnam until 1968, and we'd been in there since sort of the mid-1950s. So talk about the failure to perform the tasks of a strategic leader. Got to get the big ideas right, the strategy, you have to communicate them effectively, have to oversee the implementation, have to determine how to refine them and do it again and again and again as an intellectual construct. And that we built at the belfercenter.org. There's a website on strategic leadership that captures this. We failed to do that. And it really was driven home to me when I went back and revisited Vietnam. So quite striking. But then later, of course, I saw this in Haiti. where we were basically rebuilding the country. I mean, I had great joy, great pleasure, trying to get megawatts back on the grid, trying to get jobs going again, training the host nation security forces, all this stuff, and also doing some manhunting stuff, more of a criminal activity, policing than, say, military, but very good experience. And there we did what we later did during the surge in Iraq. We lived with the people. The U.S. force in Haiti did not want to go outside Port-au-Prince and Cap-Haitien, the two big cities. So I said, fine, we're going to put all the other coalition forces as they come in. We're going to put them right out in these different locations because that's the only way to secure them. And that's exactly what we did. We would build big bases right in these communities. We'd locate them there. It was quite a logistical feat. And quite extraordinary. I mean, I would literally get on a helicopter with our lawyer and our contracting officer, would fly around, find an open space near the community that we wanted to build a base, would land, the people would run up to us, would figure out who owned it, and would cut a deal right there on the spot. And the bulldozers would be coming in within about 8 hours, and they'd build up this little location. Then Bosnia, you had a very sophisticated, well-refined, comprehensive, again, civil military counterinsurgency campaign plan, although there were really no insurgents. There were war criminals and terrorists, which we dealt with. That was the manhunt piece there in my U.S. hat. I was a one-star. But what we had was there all the elements of this kind of plan. We were training host nation police, although it was the UN doing that. We had the OSCE doing rule of law. It's another big element, the judicial side of it. We were overseeing the train and equip of the military. And then you had the high rep, the EU high rep, who was doing the politics and governance of it. Ultimately, in Iraq, we took that plan, which lots of different strands and lines of effort, as they say, and we put that on top of Mosul and said, how could we replicate that here? Noting that there is no UN, there's no IREP, there's no OSCE, there's basically no civilian NGOs at all or international organizations. So we're going to do it all. And we adapted that, and we, again, but the idea is that the way that you solidify security gains, the way you convince the people to support you or the new Iraq rather than the insurgents or the terrorists is by making their life better. And we went about that in a very comprehensive effort across the board. We assigned a unit from the 101st Airborne Division. This is the first year in Iraq now, in northern Iraq after the fight to Baghdad. And every single government entity had a partner in our organization. Some of these were easy. The Ministry of Telecommunications was our signal battalion. The hospital was our medical battalion or brigade. So the public works was our engineer units. But then we had, Mosul University, 30,000 students. And I had a little tiny civil affairs unit with maybe 5 people that knew something about education. So I took one of our 2 aviation brigade headquarters and I said, you're in charge of Mosul University. Good luck, rebuild it, because it had all been heavily looted. They did. Again, they have tremendous skill, initiative. You had people that could wire the place up. We had lawyers, contractors, everything else. I assigned my personal duty was to mentor the governor. Actually, there were others that, again, so every single ministry activity had a partner, and we just got on with it. And it was actually great fun. We did investment banking deals to revive 2 of the hotels. We found money, and this is where economics came in. We had intelligence that said that one of the banks had hidden all the money. It hadn't been stolen, as was the case in virtually all the rest of the country. We found it underwater, double wrapped in plastic, drained it, got it, and there's enough to pay the government workers. And so, I asked the bank manager, can you pay the government workers? He said, no, I don't have the authority. I asked him who has the authority. He said, the Minister of Finance. I said, well, I was just in Baghdad. After the fight to Baghdad, there is no Minister of Finance. In fact, there's not even a Ministry of Finance. He looked at me and he said, but you have the authority. I said, you're right, I do. Geneva Convention, occupying authority. And he said, so make it an order. And I wrote out an order, and he was happy to take it. He said, but no stamp. So we went out and bought a stamp in the souk and a lot of stars, and it looked good. But then I realized that night, I woke in the middle of the night, having taught Economics 101. Gosh, we're about to inject a lot of money into it's essentially a closed economy because the borders are closed. So I sat down with the governor. I had an interim governor, first governor in all of Iraq as well. We had a provincial council already that we'd established. And he said, have you considered reopening the border with Syria? I didn't even know again, this wasn't where we were supposed to go. We were supposed to stay in Baghdad. So we didn't understand Nainawa province and Mosul. So we looked up the UN Security Council resolutions on trade with Iraq. The lawyers codified all of that. I sent out a brigade commander. I said, I want to come out to a ribbon cutting ceremony in 48 hours. We will let the people on the other side of the border know we're going to open it. It had been closed by someone during the actual battles. So we reopened it. There were several mile long convoy of trucks all bringing goods into the Mosul marketplace. And I predicted to the government, to the provincial council, that if we brought in all these goods, prices would actually go down and quality would improve and there would be better choice, even though we're dumping a lot of money on the economy. So it won't drive inflation. And that's exactly what happened. So, it was really great fun. We ultimately did 5,500 small projects during the course of the rest of that year in northern Iraq. We lived with the people just as we had in Haiti, small bases. We did reconciliation with those who were thrown out of their jobs because of these very, very disastrous two decisions that fired the military without telling them what their future was, and then fired the Ba'ath Party, the ruling party, without any reconciliation process. So we created a reconciliation process, and I got the Coalition Provisional Authority to agree to it. So again, all of this was sort of the culmination of years of examination of this kind of stuff. A lot of personal reading and study along the way, because I was fascinated by the French experience in Indochine, Indochina, then our experience in Vietnam, the French in Algeria, the British in Oman, which was a perfect counterinsurgency, the British in Malaya, and a variety of others over the years, because these are very complex endeavors. This is not just attack, defend, delay, or what have you. This is, again, you're doing all of this. And again, we got no help from any international organizations for many, many years. And in our own organization, it took a very long time for the US-led Coalition Provisional Authority to get anybody up to us, which is frankly fine by us, that we had a pretty good sense of what we needed to do. We got the big ideas reasonably right. We communicated them effectively through the breadth and depth of our organization. We oversaw the implementation of it, and we sat down constantly to ask, how can we improve it? What are some great new initiatives? And we made it competitive among the brigade commanders. They're all competing to one up the other on some new great, so we had the Tigris River Valley Council, then we had the Mosul, Fathers of Mosul. And again, all of these different ideas that when the whole group, no one of us is smarter than all of us together. And you get everybody fired up about figuring out how can we do this. And then we include the Iraqis in it. Again, the first provincial council in all of Iraq, the first governor, and so forth. And it was really quite successful for quite a period of time, until tragically our reconciliation results were not approved in Baghdad at the end of our time. And that really cut the knees out from underneath the effort, because it threw thousands of people basically out of their jobs and out of their lives, because there was no other employment in Iraq than with the government in virtually any sector. There really was no free enterprise to speak of.
I mean, this is really quite a remarkable set of policies and strategies that you implemented, because ultimately you're doing exactly what it is that people want and need, and ultimately that's. And
they supported us.
Yeah,
this is the only place in Iraq that had a road and highway named after the U.S. unit that was occupying them, and they did that right before we left. And again, everybody was pitching in. Now, yes, the security started to erode over time. The insurgency started to grip hold, because again, in a lot of the other parts of the country in particular, they hadn't had the approval to conduct the reconciliation process that we had, and some of the other advantages that we had in Mosul and Nainawa province. And then it gradually, the challenges accrued over the subsequent years until, frankly, we started the surge and essentially implemented during the surge what we'd done originally in the north. But it was a 180-degree change over what it was we were doing right prior to the surge, when we'd been handing off to the Iraqis getting out of their areas and going to the big bases. We've been doing that for a year and a half or so, but the level of violence had invalidated that approach, and we now had to completely reverse what we've been doing before. And that entailed an awful lot of very, very tough fighting, a lot of tough casualties, and a number of other initiatives that were required. And for that, I was incredibly privileged to have the extraordinary Ambassador Ryan Crocker as a diplomatic partner. No commander ever had a better ambassadorial partner for that.
Well, so now I'd like to turn from Iraq to Iran and get your perspective on what, in hindsight, we did right, what we did wrong, what we should be doing now in terms of the fact that we withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal. We're pursuing a maximum pressure strategy. What's going on there, and where do you think we ought to be?
Well, Iran is a pretty desperate situation. Number one, obviously, there's enormous turmoil. There are huge demonstrations. But this is a regime that is enormous. This is not like Egypt, where the military will step back and let the Grand Ayatollah go under the bus and let somebody else be selected, then they'll still be in their privileged position. If he goes down, the entire regime goes down. And keep in mind that there are, again, literally, ultimately, you have the entire Revolutionary Guards Corps, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine. That's in addition to the regular Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine. They're all entirely loyal to the supreme leader and those who are around him. You have the Revolutionary Guards Corps Quds Force, which is sort of a combination of the CIA and our most special operations forces. And then you have something called the besieged militia, which, depending on your counting rules, it's certainly hundreds of thousands, if not millions, again, depending on how expansive you get. And these are basically pipe swingers, street thugs, who generally can be counted on and generally probably will not turn against the regime. So unless you can crack this somehow, this is a very, very different situation from others where we have seen, say, Gaddafi or Mubarak or the Tunisian dictator or others overthrown. When it comes to the Iran nuclear program, they're within, supposedly weeks of actually being able to enrich to weapons grade and therefore presumably to develop a nuclear device, although there's always been disagreement about how much expertise they have. Do they have the sufficient expertise to truly do that? We think so. But again, as you well know, that's not a trivial endeavor to take highly enriched weapons grade uranium and turn it into an object that actually can, with a trigger, create critical mass and set off a chain reaction. That's closer than they have ever been. So they're technically a threshold nuclear power. They're much closer than when I was the commander of U.S. Central Command, responsible for the Greater Middle East, or say the deputy or the director of the CIA. I did not embrace the Iran nuclear accord. I'd hoped that there were some features that could be improved, but once we made that agreement, it had significant pluses. It also had some significant minuses, but the pluses were quite substantial. They would not be where they are now remotely. It really took them, all of the enriched uranium except for the very low enriched was eliminated, taken out of the country. And 99% of that was eliminated. They reduced very substantially the number of centrifuges. The deeply buried, hardened inside the mountain enrichment facility was turned into a research facility. And we had quite good visibility through quite intrusive inspection regimes of all of this. And they did away completely with the plutonium path to a bomb. Very significant. Yes. The problem is, of course, that there were end dates to some of this. Now, they still would not be here yet, but they would be approaching. And the question is, what would limit them after that? And that was a very significant question that was never really answered. The idea is the non-proliferation, the additional protocol, actually, of the non-proliferation treaty. But again, their interpretation of that and their responsibilities were not quite clear. So that's a limit. And then the other was, of course, that they could reintegrate into the global economy. They got a number of reserves freed up. They could produce oil and export it again, and that would fuel some of the other nefarious activities that they carry out, such as the development of their missile programs, which now can reach our ally in Israel, much more accurately take out other targets in the Gulf states and so forth, including our bases, the development of the drones that we've seen used so devastatingly in Ukraine. And then there's support for the Shia militia in countries like Iraq, Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, and so forth. So you have all of these different challenges. At this point in time, I actually think that the general approach by a combination of the administration and Congress is right, which is that we're not going to get back to the agreement. It doesn't appear at this point in time. I would not have withdrawn from it, I should point out, once we were in it, because that created also some enormous challenges with our European allies and others with whom we actually reached that agreement. It was an international agreement, not just a U.S. agreement, although it was largely negotiated U.S. and Iran. So, you know, the pressure has to be increased on them. But this is one of those situations where I think we're not going to achieve what we want to achieve. The idea that you could overthrow the regime or carry out regime change, I never took very seriously, frankly, for the reasons that I described. And certainly there's no appetite nor really probably even wisdom of going in there and trying to do something, given the size of the country, what that would entail and what we've experienced, you know, with regime change in Iraq and Afghanistan. This doesn't always go according to plan, and the resource requirements are absolutely staggering. So that's a very, very difficult situation. I generally think the policy on this is about as sound as it can be, but it's all of it is, you know, it's the least bad approach rather than the most attractive approach, which is what you have to pursue.
Great. Well, I want to turn it over to our participants to ask questions. So if you have a question for General Petraeus, please put it in the Q&A, not in the chat window. And General Petraeus has graciously agreed to answer any and all questions except for those involving domestic politics for obvious reasons. Want to stay clear of that. So the first question that we have from the participants is from Bernie Horn. And the question is, how do you think the Ukraine conflict will end? Will Xi Jinping play a role in ending the conflict? Question. If so, how would it change his role in history?
Yeah, first of all, I don't think that the conditions are all right now. Neither Russia nor Ukraine is willing to seriously negotiate. Their opening positions are completely mutually exclusive. Doesn't matter who it is that tries to broker this deal. There may come a point in time where a combination of the U.S. and China, and actually many other countries, could create conditions that might make a negotiated resolution attractive. But I think there have to be several steps that take place before that. Keep in mind that as it stands right now, Vladimir Putin, despite the failures, the loss in the Battle of Kyiv, Sumy, Chernihiv, Kharkiv, Kherson, and so forth, and failure to achieve their winter offensive goals, despite all of that, Putin still seems to think that Russia is going to be able to outsuffer the Ukrainians, the Europeans, and the Americans. And so it's incumbent, frankly, on Ukraine, with our extraordinary support, $35 billion in arms material and weapon systems already, along with our NATO allies and other Western partners, to show Putin that not only will he not be able to outsuffer the Ukrainians and the others, but this war is unsustainable in the way that Afghanistan was unsustainable for the Soviet Union. And noting that probably at this point in time, Russia has in the first, whatever it is, 15 months of this war, taken maybe 8 times or more the battlefield losses that the Soviet Union took in a decade in Afghanistan. The Ukrainian offensive that is going to come, that we expect once the ground dries, and apparently it's wet again right now in some of the areas, so it could come maybe the end of May would be my guess, early June. Again, if it's very, very dry, maybe a bit sooner. We're going to see 9 additional Ukrainian brigades, 2,500 to 3,500 soldiers in each, with Western tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, and other weapon systems, not on the front lines right now, that have all been trained at training centers in Germany, the US training centers, UK, Eastern Poland, Ukraine. And they will achieve combined arms effects for the first time. In other words, tanks supported by infantry, air defense, engineers, mortars and artillery, electronic warfare, good command and control. And if you do that, this is terrifying to the enemy. We did do this during the fight to Baghdad. It's what collapsed the forces that stood up to us, especially the Republican Guards ones, and then even the besieged militia, or the Saddam Fedayeen, like the besieged militia, frankly, irregular forces. And they're going to, I think, take back a lot, liberate a lot of the territory in the south and southeast that Russia took early on in this war. I don't see them taking back Crimea just yet, but the question is, do the Russian forces crumble just locally or more broadly? I don't think they're going to be able to defend against the Ukrainians. They're going to have to withdraw from their current positions under fire to the prepared defenses, which are behind the Russian forces. In the southeast, just largely a single line. In the south, it's multiple lines. That's the most difficult imaginable maneuver. And these are forces that did not train as units. The Russians now, these units have been ground down and replacements have just been pumped into them who are not well trained, not well equipped. And I don't think they're going to be able to withstand what the Ukrainians are going to throw at them, having not been able to achieve, again, their objectives despite human wave attacks against the Ukrainians throughout the winter. Now, if that happens, then maybe you start to set the conditions where Putin realizes, together with the tightening of the personal economic and financial sanctions and export controls on Russia and the Russian economy, that maybe he needs to figure out how to get out of this. Now maybe you can get into some real negotiation. And on the Ukrainian side, you have President Zelensky, who obviously has to want this bloodshed to stop, not just on the front lines, but in the civilian communities are being hammered on a nightly basis by Russian missiles and Iranian drones, and the prospect of a Marshall-like reconstruction plan, which they desperately need, ideally using the $300 billion of Russian reserves frozen in Western institutions, which Larry Summers has, I think, very coherently laid out a legal way to do, and a security guarantee, which is most important of all. And that should come from the US-led, ideally path to NATO membership. But in the interim, there's going to have to be some kind of US-led security guarantee, coalition of the willing. You put all that together, those are the incentives for the Ukrainian side, those are the incentives for the Russian side. And now, again, I don't care who brokers this. You could involve China in it. It will take, at the end of the day, the real broker is going to be the US, because, again, the big numbers here, the big guarantees here will come from the US, not from China. But that's how it may end. Now, you could also have, though, just another frozen conflict with new front lines, with continued fighting across it. You could have a complete collapse of the Russian forces and even take back Crimea, take back all of the Ukrainian territory seized since 2014. That's not my base case, but I don't think it's impossible. So these are the scenarios, I think. These are the factors on which this will depend. Most importantly, really, how poorly do the Russians do in the face of what I think will be pretty impressive, and the first time we'll see true combined arms operations and effects. And that's a pretty big deal. And then the question will be, if it continues, will the Europeans and the Americans continue to support this? And can the Ukrainians continue to generate additional forces, noting that their population is less than 40 million and the Russians are 140 million, although the Russians have had a hemorrhaging, not just of talent, but also of military-age males.
The second question is, how can the U.S. leverage private capital markets to further national security interests?
It's a wonderful question. We have actually had dialogue with Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, Amos Hochstein, who is his deputy for economics, and some other members of the White House. And the answer, frankly, is you have to de-risk it. So let me just give you an example. Let's say that we want to compete more effectively with the Belt and Road Initiative, not just to compete because it's the Chinese, but because you want to get access to, say, strategic minerals, lithium, cobalt, all those that are so important for electric vehicles and renewable energy. To do that, again, yes, we have the International Development Finance Corporation, 60 billion assets under management, but again, a lot of that's already deployed. You have AID, you have other, you can partner with the UK's DFID, Japan Development Agency, others. You might cobble this together. But at the end of the day, what you really need is, KKR, $500 billion, Blackstone, even more than that, these others. But the problem is that we have fiduciary responsibilities. We don't do adventure capital investing. We do serious investing so that we can, again, obviously return more to our investors than they gave to us. We want to do well while doing good, to be sure. But again, we're not an instrument of the government. We'd love to help the government. We are a U.S. company. So how could you de-risk investments in some of the locations in Africa, let's say, or Latin America, where we would never invest because of, let's say, security conditions, lack of rule of law, inadequate governance, again, you name it. There's usually a host of these. And tragically, we are no longer looking for investments in Africa. 10 years ago, we thought that the Africa office in UK would ultimately turn into 2 offices in Africa, one in Nigeria, one in Ethiopia. We did do the biggest private equity deal one of those years. About 8 years ago, I played a big role in it. We bought the largest rose growing firm in the world. It was actually very exciting. We took that firm from 8,000 or 9,000 Ethiopian workers to something like 12,000 or 13,000. We had a good outcome, but fortunately, we got out right before the Ethiopian Civil War. And so obviously, we're not looking in Ethiopia and the other major economies where you can find the deal size that we need, because we don't do small deals, Nigeria, South Africa, and Kenya. Again, each of those are our challenges, much less, again, something like the Democratic Republic of Congo or these others where you have these extraordinary reserves of, again, very strategic minerals. So how do you do that? You have to de-risk. That's a difficult task. And we're working on that. And I'm not sure that we will be able to resolve it, frankly. But
great. Our next question is about the future of energy security in Western Europe. How challenging will it be for European countries to diversify their energy needs from cheap Russian hydrocarbons? From Arthur Begeman.
A lot less challenging than we thought it would be. And to some degree, thanks to Amos Hochstein, who in his earlier incarnation as the Assistant Secretary of State for Energy, and we worked with him back in those days as well. One of the individuals who works for me does a lot of infrastructure and energy work also. They did a lot of work in the pipeline system in Europe so they can backfill, push it around, and all the rest of this. And then, frankly, the European countries, Germany in particular, I think performed incredibly impressively in getting established, for example, regasification plants where they had none. And remember, Germany was hugely dependent on Russian pipeline gas. They had no ability to take LNG and regasify it, unlike some of the other countries in Europe. So Europe did an amazing job over the course of this past winter. They were helped because the winter was mild, but they're going to be in a much better situation going into next year. So it's really been quite dramatic. They're helped because the U.S. has been expanding our LNG capacity. Keep in mind, of course, that the biggest crude oil and natural gas producer in the world is the United States, thanks to our technology of deep directional drilling, hydraulic fracturing, seismic big data, our financial markets, rule and law that allows you to sell mineral rights underneath your land. Again, only in the U.S. do you see the energy revolution that has transformed the energy world. And all of a sudden, we went from actually building ourselves regasification plants to building liquefaction plants. And it's been quite dramatic in that regard. So we're exporting a lot more there. And then there were a number of other sources that were gotten where, you persuaded Japan not to take a delivery and send it to Europe and this kind of thing, say from Qatar or other exporters. So again, they've really done very, very impressively. And I think that this is not going to be as challenging as was anticipated. And the challenges were quite considerable when we entered the winter last fall.
Right. Well, we're running out of time, so I want to just give you a couple more questions. One second to last question.
Yep.
Is if you could tell us a little bit about what you've been doing at KKR, the Global Institute, because you've been there for 10 years now and investing. So that's something that we all want to find out about, what you're thinking about, what you're investing in.
We invest in virtually everything in the world, with the exception that we don't do venture capital deals. So we do next gen. The smallest deal we will do is next gen tech, and that the threshold for us is 25 million in annual recurring revenue for us to get interested. Otherwise, it is too small. Again, if you're trying to deploy over $500 billion, you can't do small deals, frankly. We also do actually credit and capital markets. We're very substantial. In fact, I believe that is now actually more than the private equity component of it. So we can do our own credit origination. We can do our own deals. We often will use one of the big banks to do a lot of the details of them, or to do an IPO or something like that. But it's been quite an extraordinary experience. Again, as I noted, I knew economics quite well. I knew nothing about private equity. And so I've had a crash course in that, noting that, again, I'm not a deal team member. What I do is the geopolitical risk and then integrate the macroeconomic analysis. There's a phenomenal global macro team, Henry McVeigh, and then Ken Melman, who does the environmental social governance issues analysis. We all get together, the three amigos, and work with a deal team. We now include a cybersecurity analysis as part of that as well when we go to the investment committee. I have actually vetoed at least 3 or 4 deals over the years, including at least 1 or 2 that the deal team really wanted to do. And in each case, actually a few years later, they thanked me for throwing myself in front of that particular bus, because the worry that we had, the threat, the risk actually did materialize, and it turned out we would not have been able to mitigate it. So that's what I do. I then help the companies in which we invest. We own over 120 companies, and then we have minority investments in at least another 100, as I mentioned. And they run into problems. And sometimes it's helpful to have someone who can come in, get with our U.S. ambassador, get with our co-investors who matter, say the European Bank for Reconstruction Development or whatever. You go in a united front to the government and explain to them what the issue is. We bring our lawyers with us, and we generally have a pretty good track record in resolving those issues. And then, frankly, I help those in the client partner group. These are the individuals that are raising the funds. We have a variety of different funds for just about everything. And I do a lot with our investors who are all trying to understand the world in which we're all trying to invest together. It's a really wonderful position. I can't believe how fortunate I have been to do that, and then to be a partner at a time when the firm has grown from 83 billion under management to, again, over 500 billion. I find it very intellectually stimulating. It's rewarding. They encourage me to do this kind of thing as well. They're happy to have me, again, teach at Yale, be on the speaking circuit, do private venture investments, over 25 of those. But all of it comes together because it is all constantly refreshing, updating, and maintaining intellectual capital on which I draw, and then the relationships around the world. I travel probably to 25 countries in a given year, many of them more than one time.
Well, so in the last couple of minutes, we were hoping to get your advice for our participants. We've got a number of students as well as people at the beginning stages of their career. And given your amazing track record of leadership, what advice would you have for the current generation of people just starting out in their careers?
Well, it's hard not to offer sort of the old trite advice about, just the sheer hard work, sheer determination, not only competing to be the best you can be, which you should do. Again, life is a competitive endeavor. Let's not, you don't get a T-shirt or a trophy in the real world for just showing up. You get it for excellence, and you have to demonstrate excellence, but you also while you're doing that, you want to try to be the best team player you can be as well. And that's really hugely important. And then this concept that I mentioned earlier, that luck is what happens when preparation meets opportunity. You have to be really, really serious about that preparation. Again, I know this sounds both common sense and, again, quite trite, except that it actually really matters. And I really did try in my career to do that. When I was a very young officer, I was jumping with the British paratroopers up at their airborne base. And we made a bunch of jumps from a balloon. It was quite a thrill because you go straight down. There's no side movement. And then my escort officer, my British comrade, asked if we wanted to go to the pub in the afternoon. Of course we did. We're paratroopers. But I said, could we stop by the military sales store on the way? I want to buy a used field marshal's baton. Because, Napoleon said that everyone carries a field marshal's baton in his rucksack, and that you never know when the call could come. His idea was that everybody should be prepared for that moment when they might be called forward. And I mean, it's partly joking, except I really was going to put it in my rucksack. And so we went in. It was an old retired sergeant major. He said, "Oh, fresh out of those, Lieutenant, but I do have this little swagger stick." I bought that swagger stick and I tied it to the frame of my rucksack with this green nylon cord. Nobody could really see what it was, but I knew what it was. And every time I picked up that rucksack, and I managed to keep it with me for decades, I would feel that, and it would remind me, you got to be ready. And so this is really quite serious stuff. And I really did try to be ready, as I've explained, with a whole variety of, you engineer the assignment. My view was, you don't ever want to have to go to the assignment officer to ask for the assignment. You want somebody asking you. You want somebody pulling you because you have demonstrated that you're going to be value added to that individual or that unit. And you get these great vantage point jobs: Supreme Allied Commander Europe, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Chief of Staff of the Army as their right-hand man. And then so when you're in one of these positions, you've actually already seen people performing those tasks, reading constantly. And then, as I mentioned, all of these out of my intellectual comfort zone experiences, because they're what prepare you for what happens when you haven't actually prepared for it as perfectly as you might, such as invading a country about which you don't know enough. So again, I think those are the two big takeaways. And again, there's just a world of extraordinary opportunities out there, and how well you are able to take advantage of them, to see what's possible materialize to make that happen, does depend, frankly, on how much excellence you can demonstrate, not just an individual, but as a team player. And then whether you're really as prepared as you possibly can be for that moment when the call comes, Petraeus for field marshal.
Well, General Petraeus, thank you so much for being so generous with your time and sharing your insights. It's been incredibly informative, but also inspirational. Your example is something that all of us should strive for. And it's really been a privilege to be with you. Thank you.
No, it's been a privilege to be with you. Thanks.
Thank you. And thanks
you can even play applause.
Exactly. Well, we have to try to give you your just due. And thank you, Anusha and Sam, for arranging this and organizing all of this. And we hope to see you all back here soon. Again, thank you very much, General.
Thank you. In person next time. Thanks, Professor.
I look forward to
Anusha and Sam.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you so much, General. Thank you, Dr. Lowe.
Good night. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.